Former Congressman Bill Owens joins us this week. Welcome. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you, Tom.
So you're attending the inauguration coming up next Friday.
I am. I will be down in D.C. I was fortunate enough to get an invite from the ambassador to the United States from Canada, Mr. McNaughton, and so I'll be attending a several-hour event, actually. It's a very neat kind of program they put on at the Canadian Embassy in D.C. They have a roof patio. It overlooks the Capitol, and so we'll be able to watch the inauguration, have some lunch, and mingle.
What are you expecting for the first 100 days of the new presidency?
Well, I think based upon how the process is unfolding now, it seems to be a little stutter-stepped. It's unclear as to how quickly some of the cabinet officials will be in place because of the ethics office issues related to their financial holdings. So I think it's not going to be as much of a burst as people may anticipate.
Do you expect most of the picks will be confirmed?
I do. I would be very surprised unless something develops where one of the nominees says, I will not conform to the requirements to divest or put into a blind trust, then I think that might force that nominee out.
Senator Jeff Sessions being considered for Attorney General. You worked with him in Washington.
I did, and I had the opportunity actually to travel with him to Ottawa for an interparliamentary conference. A very conservative man. I think my impression of him was that he was not a person of a broad understanding. He has some very narrow views, and I have some concerns about him as Attorney General.
In particular, upholding the existing laws, abortion,
I think upholding existing
gay rights.
laws, allowing his opinions to influence the positions he might take, irrespective of what the law is, and in particular, the idea that we don't want people going back and revisiting well-settled law. That's a long-standing principle at the Supreme Court and has really been a long-standing principle for virtually every administration.
Donald Trump said one of the first things he would do would be repeal the Affordable Care Act. It appears that is happening, that the Republicans will do that. The big question now is, what do they replace it with and how soon?
I have a slightly different view on that. The recent reports, in particular stories about Senators Paul, Cotton, and Corker, and recently some additions to that, including Susan Collins, indicate that they may not be prepared to vote for repeal without replace. If that's the case, and they lose those four, they will not be able to repeal Obamacare in the Senate. And that will create, I think, a major if you will, explosion within the Republican Party, because I think the House will go forward, and I think the Senate is more cautious. Obviously, as someone who voted for the Affordable Care Act, I think that it could certainly be improved, but in any event, like President Obama said in his speech, his last speech to the country, if you got a better idea, bring it forward, and I might support it too. I'm of the same opinion. The problem, I think, is that if they go ahead and repeal and delay, which is really what the plan is now, because they have no plan, then you will be in a position where insurance companies are likely to begin to more forcefully withdraw from the market, raise rates even more, and that's a significant problem that could really create chaos in the healthcare industry for not only people who were on Obamacare, but for you and I. Even if we have insurance coverage, those companies will likely begin to ratchet up the rates because they're in an area of uncertainty. And when insurance companies have uncertainty, their actuaries can't do the proper analysis. Their only recourse really is to say, we have to raise rates to protect ourselves.
You talk about people on Obamacare, 20 million plus have signed up for Obamacare. It seems unlikely, though, that their coverage would be taken away, that they would lose their coverage. Would they keep that coverage while a replacement plan is found?
Well, that's an open question. What comes out of the Republicans at this point is an unclear pathway. Some are saying repeal, delay, replace. Some are saying repeal and hedging the bet on whether there's a delay, but saying, well, no one will lose their coverage. The difficulty is they really can't assure that, because the insurance companies may say, you're going to terminate the exchanges. We're not going to wait for that to happen and get caught in July. We're going to terminate our participation now.
President Obama came to the Hill last week and basically told Democrats not to negotiate, to let the Republicans, I think in his words, own it. Is that the right tactic?
Well, I think if you listen to what President-elect Trump said, let the Democrats own Obamacare, I think it's a perfectly good tactic to at least start with, you're going to repeal this and you don't have a plan, you own it. Now, if they bring a plan forward, I think that has to change your strategy, because then you have a responsibility to the people of the United States to make sure that you have something in place. And I don't believe the Republicans will have anything for minimally 3 months, and I think more like 6 months or 8 months that they can actually bring in, sit down, and have a conversation about.
What else do you see for the Republican-led Congress in the first few months?
Well, clearly, I think they're going to take steps with regard to the border. There's been a lot of conversation about whether or not they're going to build a wall on the southern border, whether or not they're going to tear up NAFTA. So I think that's going to be one of the other areas that they will go after. This issue of raising tariffs, which the president-elect has repeated ad nauseum during the campaign and since his election. I think that that's the direction he really intends to go. I personally think that's very problematic from a national perspective. I also think it's very problematic from our region's perspective. And that to me is very troubling. And I'm hopeful that they sort of get over the Canadian and NAFTA issue and just simply allow that to move on.
Much of his focus has been the southern border and automakers going to Mexico to build their cars. When you talk about the tariffs, though, do you think he would look to put tariffs on Canadian parts coming across the border to U.S. auto plants?
I do. I think that he's made comments about the idea that Detroit should make all of the car and cars in Detroit or in Michigan, and that would preclude moving those cars, as has been talked about many times in our region. Those parts in a car may go back and forth 8-9 times, as you do some work in Windsor and some work in Michigan, and the part moves back and forth. I think that that's very problematic.
So what happens if he imposes tariffs? What's that do to trade and relations between the U.S. and Canada?
Well, I think it will dramatically impact those relationships. I think Canadians will be very frustrated and legitimately angry at us. I think it will cut down the amount of activity that goes on back and forth across the border. One could argue that that could result in more Canadian companies setting up subsidiaries in the United States to avoid those tariffs. So much like Made in America, it could benefit regions in the United States, and ours being one of the likely beneficiaries. Nonetheless, Canada will impose tariffs on our goods going into Canada, which means not necessarily the companies in our region being hurt, but I think potentially in other regions of the country being hurt.
NAFTA has been under attack for several months now by all the major political candidates,
Right.
Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, and Donald Trump, but Trump calling it the worst trade deal ever, I think, to quote him. NAFTA will likely be renegotiated, and Justin Trudeau has said that on Canada's part there's a willingness to renegotiate. But do you think that there's some fine-tuning there, or does it look like it's a trade deal that could be repealed altogether?
My suspicion is that after we get through a little bit of the drama in this, that ultimately they'll do some tweaking, and I don't think NAFTA goes away. That would be a real shock to me if that were to happen.
Locally, community leaders say NAFTA has played a positive role in bringing Canadian companies and business across the border. Is that business in jeopardy if NAFTA gets rewritten?
It certainly will make it more difficult, and it may slow down new people moving to the United States. I think that companies that are already here likely have a significant enough investment that they will continue with that investment.
Justin Trudeau seemed to be cut from the same political cloth as Mr. Obama in a number of ways. They seem to get along well. What would you see for a relationship between the U.S. and Canada with Mr. Trump and Mr. Trudeau?
I think a lot depends upon how the Trump administration proceeds. So if they proceed in a very aggressive and negative way relative to Canada, I think that will injure that relationship. If they proceed rationally and attempt to renegotiate NAFTA so that it benefits both sides, then I think that relationship will stay at a cordial level.
Both support the Keystone Pipeline. Do you think that that could be resurrected?
Absolutely. When I was speaking out in Calgary a couple of months ago, that was the first question that people asked. I think it's very likely that Keystone will be resurrected and Keystone will be implemented. What's interesting about that is that the Keystone Pipeline does not actually bring oil to the United States in the sense to be used here. It's actually oil coming out of the oil sands in northern Alberta to Texas to be refined and shipped overseas. So for the Canadians, that's very important, particularly if our access to oil and natural gas continues to grow. That will reduce what we import from Canada.
Talking about border security, pre-clearance bill, which has been in the works, you've supported when you were in Congress. One final passage in the House and Senate, the President signed it. What's the next step for that, and what does that do for traffic across the border?
In terms of the next step, the Parliament in Canada needs to act on a similar bill, which is currently, if you will, on the floor. Hopefully they will get to that early this year. Once that happens, then they can take that legislation and implement the pre-clearance agreement. What that really means is quicker passage for passengers on aircraft and trains, buses.
The hope is to put customs agents now at the central train station in Montreal, pre-screen passengers coming on Amtrak across the border. That would save about an hour at the border.
Yep.
The hope is that that might encourage more people to use train travel.
That's right.
Transition of power started off on a good foot, kind of deteriorated over the past few weeks. A lot of it back and forth in tweets. This certainly seems to be how Donald Trump is going to communicate with Americans and much of the world through tweets.
It does. It appears to me to be uncontrolled and lacking in much class or thought when those tweets go out. I think he's going to run into a significantly different environment when he gets to the White House because much of that material will have to be retained and stored because it now becomes, if you will, the property of the government. And so that's going to create some real interesting issues as to whether or not his staff tries to control that tweeting activity.